Okay, welcome. Let me wish you a Happy New Year and welcome you to the first What Matters to Me and Why at UC Irvine of this new year. This has been a wonderful series. It's now in its third season, and we're happy to have another fascinating speaker, as you'll hear about in a second, here today. For those of you who have not been to a What Matters to Me and Why before, this is fairly unique series here. It's not an academic series. It's a chance for us to hear from faculty and staff about, well, there's some wonderful words that go with this. Choices made, difficulties encountered, commitments grasped, and joys revealed. But like I like to say, basically what makes this person tick. That's really what's going on here, okay? And so the question is, what behind the academic persona successes and things like that we often hear about, what is behind that? And it gives us a chance to share in that, and it's a wonderful chance to also ask questions of some of the personalities who have shaped this campus. There are some details I need to get started with. First is, as you all know, you have lunches. Please clean those up after we're done here. There is a videotape. Those of you who don't know, all of the talks are videotaped, and they're now building into a wonderful library online. And so there's videotaping going on, and so if you would rather not appear on the videotape, then I've been asked to tell you to not sit in the front row. And so you can move back in a few seconds. You've received a questionnaire when you came in. I would strongly encourage you to fill that out. We really take those seriously. We look at them, we tabulate them, we like to hear your input on everything. Future speakers, how things went, did it meet your expectations, comments, criticisms, compliments, wonderful, everything. So please fill that out. And let me just, at this point, also note that we have our next speaker lined up in February 11th. So that's another second Wednesday of the month. That's Dave Rankensmeyer from the School of Engineering. And that will be a fantastic talk. You don't want to miss that. Registration for that will open 3 weeks in advance of that talk. Okay, so one nice thing about this series is that it brings together people from across campus, all across campus, in different fields. And maybe even better than that, it brings together students, faculty, and staff in a way that unfortunately doesn't happen all that much automatically. So with that in mind, let me give you each a chance to meet the person next to you, who very likely you don't know. And after that, I will stop this, and I will call up Daniel Kwan. So as you may know, the organizing committee consists of also faculty, students, and staff. And one of our wonderful student representatives on the committee is Daniel Kwan. He's a graduate student in computer science and has actually a significant overlap in terms of research interests with our speaker. And so he's the perfect person to introduce the speaker. Daniel.
Thanks, Jonathan. Again, my name is Daniel. I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Lander. He's a great teacher and a very dear friend to me. Dr. Lander was born in New York City, the best city in the world, in my honest opinion. He was born to two lawyers, but he did not pursue law. He instead decided to study biology, and he did his undergraduate in Yale. He then earned a combined MD, PhD from the University of California, San Francisco, under the direction of Louis Reichardt. Louis Reichardt is actually a pretty cool professor. In addition to being a faculty member in UCSF, Louis Reichardt is also a mountaineer, noted for being the first American to summit Mount Everest and K2, the highest and second highest mountains in the world. Dr. Lander was also initially a faculty member in MIT. His brother, Eric Lander, is also a faculty member in biology at MIT, and I hear that Arthur was the one who taught Eric all the biology that Eric knows. But fortunately for UCI, Dr. Lander, Arthur Lander, moved to Irvine, where his wife, Ann Kaloff, is also a faculty member. And in fact, Ann Kaloff is also an alumni of UCSF, and their labs are right next door to each other in Biological Sciences 3. So that's pretty cool. Dr. Lander is a Donald Bren Professor of Developmental and Cell Biology. He was named a Donald Bren Professor in 2013, fairly recently. He has joint appointment in biomedical engineering and the logic and philosophy of science. In 2001, he founded the Center for Complex Biological Systems, whose goal is to promote research and education in systems biology. Don't ask me to define what systems biology is. It's not that because I don't know it, it's because I can't do it justice. I'm sure Dr. Lander will. The Center for Complex Biological Systems, or CCBS as we like to call it, is highly interdisciplinary and includes students and professors from different schools and departments. And it also means a lot to me personally because one of the biggest parts of CCBS is a graduate program called the Mathematical Computational Biology Gateway Program that I joined 2.5 years ago. And I see several of the students from MCB are also in the front row, so I'm sure they will ask very good questions at the end of today's session. And it means a lot to me because when I was interviewing for graduate schools 2.5 years ago, I was actually getting rejected from every single graduate school I applied to, and Dr. Lander was actually one of the first people I met here in UCI, and he told me something that gave me the first assurance that I would be in graduate school. And so I'm so thankful for that. And of course, I made the decision to come here. And looking back in these 2.5 years, I know I made the right choice. Dr. Lander is a big reason why I know I made the right choice. He has cultivated both an intellectually stimulating environment and a family-like community in the CCBS. And that's really important for interdisciplinary research. And he also plays a very big role in the graduate program. He personally teaches some of the classes himself, including one of my favorite classes, Critical Thinking in Systems Biology, where he teaches us how to, of course, think critically and further indoctrinates us in the greatness that is systems biology. And he also makes it quite fun. Every year, he throws a live musical performance about systems biology. So maybe he'll go more in depth about his musical ability. So without further ado, here's Dr. Lander.
Thank you, Daniel, for that really nice introduction. I should tell you that the reason Daniel wasn't getting admissions into other graduate programs was not that there was any defect in his application. It was actually a stellar application. It's that he wanted to cross disciplinary boundaries. And that's still a no-no in a lot of areas, but we were very open to that. So we're really glad we have Daniel here. He's been doing great things. Okay, so do I need this? I don't know if you need me to speak up a lot, but I give a lot of talks, and I found myself being a lot more nervous preparing for this talk than is usually the case. And I think that's because, when I give talks, I have a model in mind of how it's going to go, what it's going to be like. And I realized I was lacking such a model. In this case, I had really no idea what to expect. And so I went online and I looked at some of the previous What Matters to Me and Why talks. And eventually I kind of formulated sort of a general gestalt of what this was supposed to be about. And how many of you have been on the Universal Studios studio tour? Right? Yeah. So this is, I guess, kind of like the Universal Studios studio tour of my mind. Right? So I can't guarantee you it's going to be as interesting. And you're not going to meet any celebrities along the way. And there's not going to be a part where King Kong comes along and shakes you around, but maybe some of the things I say will rattle your cage a little bit, so it'll have some of that character to them. Okay, but I thought, just to break the ice, I'll start by giving you the slightly less sanitized version of my growing up and getting here than Daniel gave you. So as Daniel said, I grew up in New York. Actually, Brooklyn. Nowadays, I understand it's trendy to be from Brooklyn. But in those days, it was quite the opposite. This was, like the era of Saturday Night Fever and John Travolta. And, Brooklyn was very déclassé. But still, it was a great place to grow up. I grew up in a half Jewish, half Italian neighborhood. You could tell there were a lot of Jewish people in the neighborhood because of the number of Chinese restaurants, which is still true to this day in New York. And as Daniel said, both my parents were trained as lawyers and practiced as lawyers, but my father was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, actually very young. I think he was about 19 when he was diagnosed. And so by the time my brother and I came along, he was already quite ill. And by the time I was 6 years old, he had to be hospitalized full time. And he passed away when I was 10. So most of my growing up was in a single-parent household. And my mother decided it was very important to be a stay-at-home mom, at least until we were in middle school. And so we kind of lived on VA benefits and things like that for quite a while, and made ends meet. So I didn't come from a background of significant financial means, but I never really noticed that growing up. I mean, we always had what we needed, and because we were a small single-parent family, we all pulled together, and we were kind of very cooperative kids. We didn't go off and do crazy things quite as much as some other kids did. And we were able to do this because my mother was a very strong-willed person, able to manage a lot of things at once. And I learned a lot of things from her. But today I'll only share two of them. One was the sense that the world out there has a lot of things wrong with it, and it's our job to fix as many of those as possible, right? And I thought maybe that came from her functioning as a lawyer. And in fact, when she went back to law, she went to work for Legal Aid and did a fantastic job in the Brooklyn office of the Legal Aid for the Elderly, which I could give you many stories about. And so I think that factored into it. But actually, I learned later in life that this is sort of a real tradition in Jewish heritage. That it's called repairing the world, right? That it's everyone's obligation to repair the world, which is broken and needs to be fixed all the time. So I learned from my mother it was important to repair the world. And the other thing I learned from her is one of the things she loved the most was going to musical theater, right? Which, being in New York, you could do. You could go to Broadway and see all these fabulous musical shows. And she had, record albums of all the great shows. And I hope most of you know what a record album is. A few of you may not. Turn to the person next to you. But anyway, she had all of those. And then she had Gilbert and Sullivan and Alan Sherman and Tom Lehrer. And so I sat at home and I listened to all these things, and I became very interested in music and songs. And so all through school, I wrote songs and wrote music and taught myself piano on a neighbor's piano. And that eventually became a really important part of my life, which was interesting because neither my parents nor my brother had any interest in being musical at all. My mother liked listening to this stuff. So apart from this, the main thing that it stirred my interest during the period of my growing up was nature and science and going out in the yard and growing things. And you may not believe that, but you can actually grow things in Brooklyn. I grew corn in my backyard. And looking at bugs and all the kind of things that kids who end up interested in biology in particular tend to do. And I continued this pattern of being sort of simultaneously interested in science and music and theater, all through elementary school, middle school, high school, and even in college. And so when I went off to Yale, which is where I went to college, I was a sort of major in molecular biology and biochemistry, but I spent a lot of my time writing cabaret shows and hanging out with the artsy crowd, which frankly were a lot more interesting than the science crowd. This was a lot of fun, but eventually I kind of looked around, even in the New York area, and asked, how many people were making a living writing musicals, and it was perhaps 2. And I thought, you know, I could go to medical school, and there'd be a slightly better chance of having a real career. So I did that. I applied to medical school and went to an MD PhD program in San Francisco. I had to be probably the only Jewish kid from New York whose mother was disappointed that he went to medical school. But that was true. She was very disappointed. I spent years trying to convince her it was not the wrong decision. But anyway, so I went to San Francisco for my MD PhD and did basic neuroscience research with Lou Reichardt and took my medical clerkships. And around then, I started realizing there was something a little strange about me in terms of, you know, my career aspirations and trajectory. And the first way I realized that was that on the medical side of things, the parts of medicine I was more interested in were the things that were the least compatible with doing research, things like family practice and psychiatry. And you know, I was doing basic research with cells and genes, and they just didn't seem to have anything to do with each other. So eventually, when I finished medical school, I decided I better just focus on the research. That, you know, I'm not going to be one of these people who tries to combine the two. And so off I went to New York for a postdoc, you know, back to the East Coast, kind of keep going back and forth between the East Coast and West Coast, see what was better. I think we know how that played out. So I went back to New York. With me was my wife, who wasn't my wife at the time, because in those days people felt like, why bother get married? You know, it's unnecessary. Shows you how much things have changed since then. But we both went to New York, and we both did postdocs there. And there I also showed how strange I was in terms of my interests, in that I probably picked the single most complicated, infeasible thing to do for my postdoctoral work. You know, just something that involved really, really complicated stuff that there's just no way I could make progress on in a short amount of time. But that's what attracted me. And luckily for me, 3 months into my postdoc, MIT came knocking on my door and said, would you like a job? Faculty job. Well, it wasn't quite that simple. And this was before even my brother was at MIT, so it was not nepotism. But you know, they wanted to interview me for a job there based on my graduate work. And by this point, I realized that, you know, my postdoc was going to take about 15 years if I really did what I wanted to do. So I accepted and moved there. And my wife had to relocate and take a second postdoc then in Boston. And so at MIT, I decided to get more serious. I stopped writing shows and, you know, and really, you know, paid attention to starting a lab. But I kept being attracted to the more sort of complex, difficult aspects of the work. And I remember one time being pulled aside by a senior faculty member, a mentor, and he said, you know, what's a nice boy like you working on something like that, right? You know, there's all these simple, straightforward things you could do. Why are you working on this really difficult, complicated sorts of stuff that nobody understands? And this was at a time in biology when people were all jumping on this sort of bandwagon of discovery. And that's because this is when we were all cloning genes, which means we were identifying the gene for, you know, Huntington's disease, and the gene for this and the gene for that. And there's like 22,000 genes in the human genome, so that's a lot of people can work on that. And that was like the major thing we were all doing. And that just never interested me that much. We did some of that, and thankfully, because I got tenure, and probably never would have if I didn't do some of that. But I mean, I just remember thinking that, you know, this is all too straightforward, and I'm not really that interested in it. And I tried reaching out to, you know, engineers and mathematicians and people who dealt with complex things at MIT, and you know, they were all very busy. They had their own stuff to do, and they didn't really have time for a kind of junior confused biologist. So nothing really came of it. Now, I was at MIT for about 8 years, and after my wife finished her second postdoc, she needed to find a job. And we quickly learned that, in academia, in most of the country, if one member of the couple is employed already, everyone figures they can get the other one for cheap, right? And actually, my wife even had an experience at a medical school where they looked her in the eye and said, "So how little will you settle for?" So my wife is a stubborn person, probably more, at least as stubborn as I am. And so she did not like being treated that way. And so she said, "Okay, I'm going to the University of Iowa," where they offered her a really spectacular job. And so we commuted between Iowa and Boston for 3.5 years. And that was an interesting experience. But during that time, I was able to focus and get tenure. And then as soon as I had tenure, we said, "Okay, we're out of here. We're going to find some place we can both go." And that's how we came to UCI. Because even then, UCI had a reputation for being a lot more welcoming to couples. They had a lot more couples on the faculty, in fact, at that time. And we already knew people here, and they were close to our field. And so we managed, with quite a bit of luck and help of the people who were here, to relocate here and have our labs near each other. And we've been here now 20 years. So when I got to UCI, I had a lot more time on my hands. Because I was tenured, right? So now you couldn't fire me if I did crazy things. And so I again reached out to engineers and mathematicians and computer scientists. And this time the reception was entirely different. Some of them actually were really interested in finding out what it was that was interesting me so much. And I was able to forge some collaborations with two mathematicians in particular that I continue to collaborate with today, Fred Wan and Ching Ni. Where we just agreed to keep talking until we finally learned each other's language and then decided to help each other out. And that just led to a tremendous relief for me, because suddenly I was able to work on all this complicated stuff. And I realized something, that the reason why I wasn't so interested in this kind of straightforward discovery is because I was interested in understanding complicated things, and that it actually could be done, right? It wasn't that you had to stay away from them because they were complicated. It's just that you had to work with people who had the tools to understand complexity. And so this turned out to be happening at a really opportune time, because all those people who cloned all those 22,000 genes were beginning to realize that just having a long list of stuff didn't actually give them very much. And they also needed to understand all this stuff. And so that's kind of how systems biology, which Daniel referred to, got born. It was this idea that you need to have a discipline that deals with the real complexity of biology and synthesizes it all together with the help of math and computer science and engineering and physics and chemistry and so on. And it was just the right time to be doing it, and UCI was just the right place to be kicking it off. Now, this idea that understanding things is not the same thing as just knowing stuff, right? I mean, actually, in retrospect, turns out to be something that had bugged me my whole life. I always liked courses in school where people took you through something and got you to understand it. And I was always really frustrated at things like, music appreciation, where they play you, here, this is what great music sounds like. This is what not great music sounds like. Well, to help me understand what the difference is. I loved music theory. In fact, in graduate school, I would go off every Saturday and just take music theory classes, just because that was my way to, get at the real bottom of what was going on with things that are complex. And it turns out that being aware of this dichotomy also matters in my teaching. Right? When I teach students, I think it's more important to emphasize teaching the ability to understand complicated things than it is to fill them up with facts. Okay. So after a while of kind of being in this mode of doing the systems biology and dealing with complexity, I realized that if you think about the world at large and you think about all the bad stuff in the world, the wars and the poverty and hatred and ruining the environment and so on. you could imagine a lot of this has to do with failures in understanding complex things, right? Because, the reality is we all have access to the same data, right? Everything's out there to be learned, and yet you still see countries fighting, you see people hating each other, right? All this stuff is going on probably about the same rate it's always been going on in human history, right? I mean, there's no evidence that as we get more enlightened, we're doing any better on any of this. And so, one wonders whether what we're learning over here in the scientific arena about how to understand complicated stuff could in some way spill over to the personal and social and political arena. And so I began to think a lot about that topic and researched it a little bit, read books on what people have written about this issue of what people need to know to fix the problems of the world. Right? You can see there's my mother in the background, sort of motivating me here. And if you do that, you find out the conventional wisdom is that people make bad decisions because of bad knowledge, right? They don't know enough. If they knew better, right, they wouldn't buy stocks when they're high and sell them when they're low, right? Or they wouldn't pick spouses that aren't good for them, or who are going to hurt them. All the things that people do. Right? If they knew better, if they had better information, right, all these ills of the world, would be mitigated. And that's still a very prevalent view, and it's a view that drives a lot of what we teach in the university. Right? We want to give people the knowledge so they can go out and make smarter decisions in the world. But it's interesting that there's not a lot of scientific evidence that works. And there's a really interesting guy who happens to be at Yale Law School. I don't know if any of you have ever encountered any of his writings. A guy by the name of Dan Kahan, who does studies on this issue of whether it's really knowledge that's influencing people's opinions and their decisions. And one of the most famous ones he did is on the issue of climate change. So, of course, that's something we're all very familiar with here at UCI. And he wanted to understand whether it was really true what most pundits say, which is that those people who deny the relevance and importance of climate change do so because they don't know enough science. And if we could give them enough scientific information, right, they would know better. Right? And so he asked, he surveyed a lot of people, and he asked, of the people who are supporters of the idea that climate change is very important and needs to be dealt with versus people who deny it, he assessed their scientific skills on a scale that the NSF provides of basic scientific knowledge, and asked, do the people who are more science savvy, right, are they the ones who are more aware of global warming issues and think they're more important? And the answer was not at all. There was no correlation between scientific acumen and your beliefs about global warming. And then he said, okay, let's try something else. Let's look at sort of personality traits. The ones who are kind of egalitarian, they believe in community, versus the ones who are sort of iconoclastic and individualistic, right? How do they fall out on this issue? And there it was very clear. The egalitarian communitarians believed global warming was an issue we had to deal with, and the people who didn't trust authority and were very individualistic said, no, this is not important at all. That's not a surprise. Here's the surprise. Within those two groups, then he asked about the people who were more scientifically and less scientifically literate. So among the people who were, communitarian, egalitarian, the more scientifically literate you were, the more likely you were to consider global warming an important issue. Among the people who were, individualistic and distrusted authority, the more scientifically literate you were, the less likely you were to consider global warming an important issue, right? And so what this told him is that the science was not actually informing people's decisions. The science was ornamentation that people were using on their prejudices, right? You plucked out the scientific facts you needed to support what you already were convinced were true, right? And so that goes a long way to explaining, right, why you can have these wide differences of opinion when everyone has access to the same facts. Is the facts are being used as window dressing, not actually to achieve any sort of understanding of the problem. And that was probably true on both sides. And Kahan's gone on and done this for other issues, from gun control to other things as well. It's really interesting. You should read that stuff if you're interested in this topic. Anyway, I think there are a lot of lessons that we as educators here at the university can learn from Kahan's work. And what that work tells me is a lot of what we do as educators is actually counterproductive, particularly in what we do in science. That we tend to deliver science as the job of filling people's heads with facts, right? We just fill them up with facts, and we tell them they should accept those facts. Why? Because smart people generated them, right? Everybody knows E equals mc squared. A tiny fraction of you know what E, M, and C stand for, and probably none of you knows how it came about that Einstein got to E equals mc squared, right? But the first two are not important, right? I mean, why should you believe this just because Einstein said so, right? Why should you believe evolution, by natural selection just because Darwin said so, right? The reason isn't because Darwin said so, right? It's because there's evidence and how you generate opinions out of the evidence. There's how do you understand. And we're not teaching that, right? In fact, the more complex, the more complicated the world gets, the more we back off from teaching how we actually got to any understanding and just give people the facts, right? Ebola works this way. Lasers do this, right? Someone discovered that, and it's important, and it's a cool fact, and you should know it. And that tends to be what we emphasize. In a sense, we're asking people to take science on faith, right? They should take it on faith because smart people did this. You're not smart enough to figure it out yourself, so you should trust us, right? And one of the problems with this is that the things we're telling people, well, they change, right? We used to all be told to stay away from saturated fatty fats, right? And now we're told to stay away from carbohydrates, right? I used to teach cell biology, and I would walk in with the textbook, which was this humongous 20-pound thing, right, and slam it down on the desk in front of 400 undergraduates, and I'd say, this is our textbook for this year. About 30% of what you read in this textbook is wrong. There'd be a hush in the audience. Then I'd say, here's the problem. I can't tell you which 30%. So the first time I did that, there was such an outcry. In fact, the undergraduates came afterwards to find me, and many were visibly upset. No one had ever done this to them before. How could they study knowing that 30% of this was wrong and not knowing which 30%? And that taught me a lot, right? It taught me what their expectations were. But that's the reality of science. You're not doing science if you're not open to the fact that everything you believe may change in the light of new evidence that comes to bear. And so the result then is when we teach people by filling their heads with facts, and then the facts change, well, then they just look at us like a bunch of idiots, right? We're just, we're squabbling. We don't know what's really true or not, right? And so that underscores this feeling that science is just a bunch of articles of faith that people should believe because some folks in authority told them to believe it, right? And that's dangerous, right, in my opinion, right? So it's dangerous because that's the kind of thing that enables people to do what Kahan observed, right? To take the facts and pluck them one at a time and just use them as window dressing on prejudices and to support their politics. And I don't think we have to do that. I think we can do better. From my experience focusing on the understanding of things that are complicated, I actually think anybody can understand complicated things. Right? It does not take calculus or physics or any particular discipline. It takes time, it takes exposure, it takes practice. But things like, why is there always traffic on the 405? Why are mutual funds a bad idea, which they are? Why do little kids never like jazz, which they invariably don't? Why do we get old? Why do we die? Right? I mean, these are great questions, and every one of us has the capacity to achieve some understanding on those questions. And one of the reasons I believe that, which comes out of my experiences in systems biology, is I think there's only a finite number of ways in which complexity happens in the world. And we know a lot about some of these. Right? In the sciences, we talk about dynamics and statistics and probability and so on, and that gives us words to describe them. But what we see in the real world is phenomena that are similar in many, many different areas. Like, in the world of business, we see business cycles. Right? I have a good friend who's a staunch capitalist. And he fully understands how competition drives things towards getting better. And so he can't understand why businesses should have cycles, right? Well, that's natural that he can't understand it because he needs to learn something about dynamics, right, that teach about how cycles come about. But it helps to know that those same cycles are the same cycles that explain the Earth going around the sun and the moon going around the Earth. And they're the same cycles that explain why someone with multiple sclerosis, their hand goes like that every time they reach for an object, right? Those seem like completely different areas, business cycles and the physics of the planets and hands reaching for objects. But the complexity, right, the complex dynamics are the same in those cases. And everyone is actually able to learn that. So one thing that matters to me is to try to do something about the way we educate people. So we take into account the importance of educating people to understand and not just to know about the great discoveries of the world. Okay, now I'm getting close to the end here. So in finishing up, I wanted to talk about a word that I snuck in there a few moments ago, which is the word faith. I said that the problem was we were asking people to take scientific facts on faith. And you might think that I have a fairly low opinion of faith. And I know in this series, many people have talked about their faith, right, their religious faith. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about faith. I was raised as a Jew, and I know all the aspects of the religion. But at the end of the day, I've decided that faith is not really a part of even my religious experience, right? Because I feel like faith in many ways is the antithesis of understanding, right? To understand something presumes it's changeable, right? If I understand something, it means if new facts come along, I can understand it differently. But faith, by definition, means I accept. I accept something that I was told is the case. And so in my life, I find that these are pretty much incompatible. And I want to substitute understanding for faith wherever possible. And, part of why I think that's a reasonable thing to do is because, as we all know, faith has been an excuse for a lot of really nasty things in this world. Everything from the, auto da fes of the Middle Ages that burned some of my ancestors, and I'm sure many of yours, to what happened in Paris this month, right, which was done in the name of faith, right? So the faith has served as an excuse for some pretty bad things. But on the other hand, it's also true that faith provides a lot of comfort and condolence, right, in this world. And there are tremendously good things that come from having faith. And so you might ask, is there a way to get around that without it being faith-based? And so I'll end by sharing with you an experience that's a very important experience in my life, which is that in 2000, my wife and I had our first child here at UCI Medical Center, and she was born with a very severe birth defect syndrome. We had no idea what was going on, that this was going to happen, and it took several days before they sort of figured out what she had. And she lived for 31 days in the neonatal intensive care unit and then passed away. And this was our first child, and we'd worked very hard, as did many physicians, to get us to the point where we could have her. And so we were extremely, full of grief as a result of this event. And we've gone on since, and we now have a healthy daughter who's absolutely wonderful and is 12 years old. But at the time, this was the sort of experience that I hope none of you have had, and I hope none of you ever will have, of having a child who dies. And you can imagine that having faith in something supernatural would be extremely, and would have been extremely comforting in a situation like that. And we certainly did talk to people of faith and get their opinions on all kinds of things during the process. But in the end, I think what we did do was better. We're both biologists, and our daughter had a birth defect syndrome that hardly anything was known about in 2000. And so we simply said, we're going to work on this. We're going to try to make it better. And so we contacted the 3 people in the world who cared at all about it, and we said, we're on board, what can we do? And by 2004, the gene had been identified, in part with our help. And within 4 years after that, we had the first mouse animal model of the disease. Then we had a zebrafish model of the disease. We can now study the heart defects in the disease. And right now, this month, we're working on a grant to actually fund research on a treatment for this disorder. I mean, obviously, it's not going to help our daughter, but we're now associated with the foundation for this disease, and we've met lots of other families and lots of other kids. And the feeling that we are contributing to the understanding of something that's influencing so many people is really consoling. And, of course, we can never forget the grief we had, but it's certainly, I think it goes a very long way to dealing with it, to being able to approach it by saying, how can we understand what's going on? So I think it is possible to find ways to use understanding to be just as powerful as faith. Closing up this last story brings me back to that thing I said about my mother and repairing the world. That in many ways what drove us to want to work on obscure birth defect syndrome was the feeling that, hey, here's something in the world that we're really motivated to work on. Let's get to it. But I have to say, the real lesson I learned from this is actually why. It's why there's this tradition, particularly in Judaism, of repairing the world. I mean, there's no chance that any of us can really have a truly substantial effect on the world. There's so many things broken about it. So why should we focus on repairing it? And I guess the thing that I learned through this particular experience is that the reason you repair the world is because in doing so, you repair yourself. So with that, I think I've used up a lot of my time. So I'll thank you for your understanding.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. We now have time for questions and answers. There are microphones going around, at least 2, one on each side of the room. So please raise your hand and someone will come around and then speak in the microphone.
Sean.
Thanks. So one thing I took away from your talk was this constant theme on, rather than filling people's heads with facts, to shift their perspective and encourage understanding. But it made me wonder, and maybe to my own detriment because I'm in your graduate program, have you considered working more with educators? And then as a second part in the question, have you considered anything about teaching and helping professors become better educators?
So yeah, the short answer is yes. And in fact, our center sponsored a couple of workshops on systems biology education over the last couple of years, aimed at trying to figure out what's the right way to do that. And through that, I've made some nice contacts with people in the School of Education here, which is actually wonderful that we have a School of Education. It's a fairly new school here. And so I'm hoping through those contacts and contacts with others to personally get more involved in this issue of how to educate educators to be aware of this issue and what to do about it. There's one way in the back.
In the back.
So when your mother was disappointed that you were going into an MD PhD program, what is it that she wanted you to do?
Well, she wanted me to go to Broadway and write musicals. She did. She pointed at Stephen Sondheim and she said, "See what he's doing? You could do that better."
I think you've made a beautiful argument for interdisciplinarity and the importance of bringing people who think differently together for deeper understanding. And to me, that's also an incredible argument for the study of humanities. I work in humanities. And your music background speaks to the arts and a way to approach problems differently. So how much do you think your love and study of music influenced the way you were able to think about science differently? And would you also encourage an interdisciplinarity that includes humanities and liberal arts in the world of science to get people to approach things differently?
That's a great question, and the answer is definitely yes. I think it's had a huge impact. So, for example, my interest in music and the arts in general has had a huge impact on the way I do science. There's a phrase in jazz lingo called "going outside." I don't know if you're familiar with jazz. It's when a player plays within the sort of normal structure of the piece, the diatonic scale and so on, and then at one little point deviates in some really significant way, right? And then might deviate a little more the next time around, and deviate a little more, and then come a little back, right? And so that's called going outside, right? And when your ear is trained, when you're used to listening, that's what you live for, is to hear these little departures from the ordinary, because that's where you learn new things, right? When things step out from what you expect. I think this is true in the visual arts too, right? That the real definition of art is when it's what you're not expecting is put in front of you. And that resonates with the sciences, because in the sciences, when you're doing experiments that give you the answers that you expect, you're not learning that much, right? I mean, you're filling in the knowledge base. You're adding more arrows to the diagram, and we all do that. But it's when the answers take you outside to something that can't possibly be right? That's when you're going to get new understanding that you didn't have before. And so my appreciation for that, I think in large part, comes from my interactions with music.
I think it's also important to understand the whys and not just the hows things happen, and the should we, not just can we, side of things.
Right, I agree with that too.
Yeah.
Hey, Dr. Lander. So you said that when you're at MIT, you were trying to do some very complex work and trying to do something interdisciplinary, but it didn't really seem to end up working. But when you got here, it worked. So I was wondering, what exactly did you do differently the second time around in trying to build a program around interdisciplinary?
I don't think it was me, I think it was the place. So really, if you go to MIT, right, all the folks in math and engineering, I mean, they're all at the top of the game in the National Academy and so on. They've got a full dance card, right? I mean, they're really busy with the things that are going to advance their careers, right? So you go to them, they're first going to look at, well, what's this going to do for me? To have a little foray into biology. That's going to be number 30 on the list, right? When I came here, people were just more open to the idea that, yeah, I could try something a little crazy, and I have room for that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the culture of this place, right? And it's a culture that I've helped to try to propagate, or at least hope to try to propagate, is that, if you leave time in your intellectual life for something that doesn't seem like it's going to benefit you right now, then you leave yourself open to, to really new and interesting stuff.
Question. So on the note of Irvine being different from Boston, you also said that this school was a lot more friendly towards couples working
Yes.
here. And why do you think that is?
Well, you know, it's like, with a lot of things with culture, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what the reasons are for that. But I certainly know by the time I knew anything about this place, which is actually when I was in graduate school. I visited Irvine and did some work in Sue Bryant's lab. That even by that point, maybe because the place was so new and had been formed relatively quickly, there were quite a few couples on the faculty, often in the same discipline. And so that was just considered the norm, right? Whereas a place like MIT or any of the old traditional universities, their tradition goes back to a time when, of course, all the faculty were men, right? So there wouldn't have been the option, right, to have had that as a tradition. But here from the beginning, there was a tradition. And then I think many people played a role in institutionalizing that tradition. So for example, the fact that now we actually have formal programs for spousal hiring, and I think we were one of the first universities to really institutionalize that. I think that's because there were people who were very sympathetic to that idea and pushed for it early on.
More questions?
I hate to ask such a shallow question when you gave such a moving description of your philosophy and your daughter and so on, but I would like to understand one thing, and that is, why are mutual funds a bad idea?
Because there are numerous studies that show that on average they will underperform index funds, right, or just the market as a whole. Right? That basically people are gambling, and people who are gambling and trading at the same time are always going to underperform just leaving everything right on something that goes with the whole market. And there's lots and lots of studies showing that, and every economist knows it, and yet people can't resist writing these magazine articles about which mutual funds to pick for this year, right? But it's always a different set for the next year because their performance is largely chance from year to year.
Any other questions? The depth of that question is a few more minutes if there's any questions.
Here you are emphasizing understanding as opposed to facts. I just want to know, what was the name of the birth defect that you've been working on?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should have mentioned. It's called Cornelia de Lange syndrome, named after a Dutch pediatrician named Cornelia de Lange. It's not that uncommon. It's about 1 in 10,000 or so, which among birth defects, some of them are as rare as 1 in several 100,000 of births. But actually it turns out, and this again relates to this whole issue of understanding and complexity, is that there's now emerging a whole class of birth defect syndromes, which this is one of the sort of founding members of the class, that are all caused by subtle shifts in the levels of expression of hundreds or thousands of genes. A completely different idea of what most geneticists thought of the cause of genetic disease is you have one thing wrong and all the things controlled by that thing are dead, and so that thing goes awry. But all of these turn out to be syndromes where just slight changes in the levels of various genes and gene products in your body cause birth defects all over the body in all kinds of organ systems. And the reason that turns out to be really interesting for clinical medicine is that most birth defects are isolated, and no one knows if they have any genetics at all underlying. They're just someone's born with a cleft lip or a heart defect or a limb problem. And most of them are not mappable to very specific syndromes. And so what we think is that we all vary from one another in the levels of our gene products, and sometimes an unfortunate combination of variation gets together. right, in an offspring, and one thing goes wrong. And so if we really want to learn about those things, if we want to understand those isolated ones, it turns out that syndromes like the one my daughter have may actually be the key to figuring all this out. And so that's one of the great things that's actually come about working on that. I should say one more thing about birth defects, since you bring it up, and it's very interesting. You know, something like 6% of the population are affected with birth defects. I'm sure some of you in the room had a birth defect, and most of you probably know people who had birth defects. But if you look at the amount of attention in the media that birth defects get, it's almost none compared to, say, AIDS, right, which affects a tinier fraction of people, prostate cancer, you know, erectile dysfunction, right? You know, I mean, there are many, many things that get a tremendous amount of play, and nobody talks about birth defects, right? It's kind of the last medical taboo. And I think it's because, you know, so many of us are parents, and it's so frightening. Just the idea of a child having any sort of birth defects is so frightening that we just want to close our eyes and not think about it. And I certainly would have fallen into that camp before it happened to my family. So I'll just put that out there to let you think about that. This is actually one of the biggest medical problems that we face, and people don't want to talk about it. You know, so maybe if we talk about it more, we'll actually make some more progress on it.
Great. So let me remind you that you have questionnaires. We would appreciate you to fill them out, turn them in back there. And let me finally, on behalf of the Campus Climate Council and all of us in the audience, thank Mr. Lander for a fascinating